I'm reporting on work that has been jointly led by myself and Christine Stevenson. And this has all been done in Forest Service land, and the supervising archaeologist for these projects has been Jeremy Haynes of the Flagstaff District. Like everyone else, I need to mention that Dave Wilcox has been an enormous help. He's been a mentor toward all of us, and probably that's why we're all here today. This work wasn't only done by Christine and myself. This was done by a group of people, and I want to acknowledge them. Rich Rogers, Marlene Conklin from the museum has been just wonderful, helping give me access to museum records to support this. April Peters, Mike Benzig, Joe and Nancy Jordan have all been involved with helping this. So these are all the avocational archaeologists that have been involved. And then we've had great help from 5 professional archaeologists, and I want to thank them all. The bulk of my talk today is going to be about some work done in what we refer to as the Deadman's Wash Frontier Zone, which is between Sunset Crater and Wapatki on Forest Service land. But as prelude to that, and to lay a basis for what we're doing out there, I wanted to talk about another project that Christine and I have just completed with the help from these other people. And this has been out in the Angel area, which is east of Winona. And just for perspective on this thing, this is the survey I'm talking down here, and that's this little guy here, 3 square miles. And it's taken us 5 years to do that project. And the project I'm going to be talking about is out here, and this is 100 square miles, so it's a much more ambitious activity. But this project down here at the Angel really laid the foundation for what we're doing out in the Deadman's area. We actually did a full survey, meaning walking 20-meter transects of 3 square miles out there. When we started, as far as the world was concerned, the museum had noted that there were 4 small sites out there back in the 1930s. The Forest Service had 6 sites that they had recorded out there in the 1960s. And then a para-archaeologist group had gone out there in the 1970s that found some other sites, but they had never been field checked and recorded. So basically when we started, there were 10 known sites out there. Up in this area, 42 new sites. Down in this area, 16 sites, 11 sites down here, 9 sites here, 13 sites here, and 62 sites here. And through that, we worked out methods which we feel are very suitable for surveying sites and getting an idea of being able to understand settlement patterns. There's a lot of ways of slicing and dicing the data, but I just wanted to show you a few things that we did out there which are going to be relevant to the work we do out in Deadman's. One we were interested was the site distribution and type of sites heavily influenced by the topography, the landscape, the drainages, and it quickly became evident that that was true. As an example, we found that all the larger sites, pueblos, which were 11 to 20 rooms, all had to be located in the north, on the north side of Young's Canyon, which is a major drainage out there. And what was peculiar about the north side of it is a cinder on basalt surface, as basalt flow come out of an old volcano Merrill crater. You got south of Young's Canyon, and it's cinders on top of limestone. And if you look at the data, you find a significant difference in terms of the size of the sites, the age of the sites, and how the sites were being used. Another thing that we found by looking at that, there seemed to be 2 occupation periods that existed. That there was one grouping of sites that was occurring down here, somewhere centered around the 1100 period, and then another group was sites up here around the, I think it was about the 1180 period. So it seemed like there were two waves of occupation that came in there. So that we really found interesting, and it showed that the analytical techniques that are used in archaeologists are good for being able to see occupation periods. The other thing we were looking at was like site density, and we find that on the north side of Young's Canyon, the site density was almost 70 sites per square miles, which was one of the highest site densities in the entire Coconino National Forest, where south of Young's Canyon, it was about 45, which still is a very high site density. One thing that's interesting about that, if you look at the literature, et cetera, of this area, it was assumed that there really weren't too many people living out in that area because of possible water sources or the condition of the soils. And it actually turns out in that area is one of the highest site densities and some very large sites of anywhere you're going to find in the Coconino National Forest. So that was a very interesting discovery. The other thing, and this was not a surprise, according to the conventional wisdom, we would expect to see Sonava occupation out there, and analysis of the shirt types showed that on average, an average site out there, the plain wares were over 80% Alameda brown wares. So that was no surprise there. But we started looking at it a little bit more. We found that about 8 sites up there on the northern side, we had plain wares that were in excess of 50% Kayenta Anasazi. These were Tusayan gray wares. So it kind of showed that there was a Kayenta Anasazi presence out there, which was a bit unexpected. And so this was just a few simple ways of looking at all the data that we had collected out there. What the experience showed Christine and I was that, and I guess we needed to reaffirm it for ourselves because we were avocational archaeologists, that the traditional ways of analyzing shirt types at a site was very, very useful for being able to assign a culture to a site and be able to come up with an estimate of a date range of when the site was built and occupied. We also concluded that some earlier methods or some other methods of using sherds at a site had some restrictions to them. We feel that it wasn't enough just to say that there was a presence or absence of certain types there, that you really needed to do a count of the various types there to have some confidence that your results were valid. So we feel that a complete analysis of surface artifacts is necessary for these methods to be valid. For plain wares, we ran into immediately a problem that some of our sites may only have a couple hundred plain wares, and we had the time then to actually pin flag and identify every one of those. But there are some sites out there in which I estimate the number of sherds laying on the ground exceeds 100,000. So these are not small sites with just a few sherds. Sometimes you're afraid to walk on the ground out there. So what do you do there? Well, then you obviously have to sample the plain wares. And so we came up with some methods of sampling them, which we feel hold true. Decorated wares, we looked at various sites for doing this, and we've decided that it wasn't appropriate to sample the decorated wares. It was necessary to count, identify and count every decorated ware that you could identify by type to come up with a truly valid number that you could defend for date ranges. So we then have taken these lessons learned and then taken them out to the Deadman's area. Now, the Deadman's Wash region that we're studying falls within this red line, which is basically the loop road between Sunset Crater and Wapatki. And it's a huge, huge area, and it is just absolutely rich with archaeology sites, and it's only been lightly studied, and it's been very exciting for us to be able to study that area and for the simple discoveries that can be made and the excitement associated with that. Just to talk a little bit about this region from a topology standpoint, its highest elevation is about 7,300 feet, and going north it gets down to about 5,700 feet, and then going to the east it gets down to about 5,000 feet. Well, what we're talking about here is going through 3 environmental zones, going from ponderosa forest through pinyon juniper into the grasslands. It's bisected by a major drainage called Deadman's Wash, and it has a number of other drainages and steps and features, so it's a really interesting site. Here's some information I pulled out of a study done by Harold Colton from 1936 to 1956. He studied rainfall patterns in the Flagstaff area, had rain gauges out in this area. And what he was finding is that on average, when you get into the upper part of the study area, they get about 17 inches of rain. You start getting down lower elevation, it gets down to about 12.5 inches here, 11 inches here. You finally get down to the Wapatki Visitor Center, you're getting down to 7 inches. So you have a very diverse rainfall pattern, and you also have a very diverse kinds of environment there. To put this in some kind of perspective, Wapatki is about 53 square miles. Our study area is 100 square miles, so it's twice the size of Wapatki. I'll mention that in the Wapatki survey in the 1980s, that they identified about 2,600 sites within the monument. The bulk of those sites, the majority of those sites, were found up in the grassland areas, which encompasses about 30 square miles. And so say there's 2,000 sites up here. I would not be surprised if we find 6,000 to 8,000 sites in that area if it was fully studied. The other thing that's interesting about this area, and it's intrigued people for a lot of years, going back to some of Dr. Colton's work back in the 1930s, is that it's an area in which 3 prehistoric cultures intermingled for a long period of time. We had the Koanina coming down from the Grand Canyon area, we had the Sonola coming up from the south, and we had the Kayenta Anasazi coming in from the northeast and the east and the southeast. And these people intermingled in this area for about 150 years, and so a question has always been, where did each of those cultures live and when, and how did they intermingle? And we're hoping through this study that we can add some information to help refine our understanding of that. Now, working out there, we really have 2 masters that we're trying to serve. One is the needs of the Coconino National Forest, and they have certain needs regarding managing the forest. The other are research needs, and I'm finding working with Dave, he takes a research perspective on it. I find working with Jeremy Haynes, he takes a land management, and so our approach, Christine and I are doing, is try to satisfy both. And so we want to develop a more complete picture of prehistoric sites out there, generate complete site records per Coconino National Forest database standards, provide up-to-scale site maps, artifact files per database standards, digital photo logs, GPS perimeter tracks, etc. We also want to carry out research on settlement patterns, which is what's the prehistoric culture distribution over time and space, what are the site types over time and space, and what are the artifact distributions over time and space. So, while meeting the forest land management objectives, we want to determine these settlement patterns, but Christine and I sat down over coffee one day and said there was no way we're going to do a full survey of 100 square miles. It took us 5 years, and I figured we walked about 600 to 800 miles apiece in those 3 square miles. If you've ever done that kind of a survey, there's a lot of walking involved. And so we finally decided our legs just weren't fit enough. And also she said I'd be in my wheelchair long before then, and she couldn't push me around in that rough terrain. So we're looking at a number of sources for sites, and I, Christine, Rich Rogers, Mike Benzik, we've done a lot of walking around on foot looking for sites, and we've identified over 100 sites. And now when I talk about a site, I don't mean a small agricultural site, I mean a habitation site with lots of artifacts around it. If we see there's just so much out there, we want to concentrate on the larger sites. Joe Vogel, I've given Joe the instruction, I don't want Joe to do any more aerial surveys out there. He has provided me with information on about 131 sites out there. It takes me a full day to go out and find and field check each of these sites. That's about 40 days of work for me to just to field check his sites. There was a project done back in the 1970s that was put in a backlog file that were 57 sites associated with a survey done for putting a water distribution system in. And I've gone out and relocated all those and re-recorded them. Worked with Chris Donham. His field school has done a lot of work out there, and he's turned over all his records for 75 sites his field school has provided, et cetera. So as a comparison of what we're finding, we have no large sites like the Wapatki Pueblo, but I have at least one site out there that I think approaches a 50-room kind of configuration. In Wapatki, they have 8 sites in the 21 to 35-room category. I think we have at least 30 identified so far. They have 49 sites in the 10-room category. We have 50 so far. They have 1 ball court. We have 3, 2 ceremonial rooms. We have at least 6 identified so far. I used the 1980 Wapatki Archaeology Survey as a really, really good reference on techniques for analyzing and dating sites. And I refer a lot of my work to that. A quandary we had was, how do we date the sites? There's a whole variety of systems for doing that. We need to initially get the site date range, and out of that you can then infer the Pueblo phases, the Coanina phases, Sonagua phases, like Jim was talking about earlier. But it turns out there's a lot of discussion about the best way to do that. A method that I think holds the best approach is something called mean ceramic dating. It's a simple statistical way of calculating a date range. And what you can do is just put your field data into that, and a set of equations can calculate that date range for you. And I've looked at that over a number of different sites, even went back and compared this method through some of the stuff that Dr. Colton had done back in the 40s. And I think it holds up. It has one problem. I mentioned to an archaeologist, it's going to take some of the guesswork out of coming up with a date range for a site. And the answer I got was, well, we don't like that. We like the guess. So we'll see. We developed an Excel tool that all you have to do is plug your field data in, and then it calculates the ceramic date range through a variety of different methods. And as an example, this happens to be one site here, which we call a mixed culture site. Unlike out in the Angel area, many of our sites, obviously we have a lot of pottery coming in from all 3 different cultures. So we can't say there's a dominant culture, but we can say it's a mixed culture site. And so in this particular case, the MCD range was about from 1120 to 1220. The ceramic group dating method was done by the Wapatki people. It gives a much broader range. And I'm suggesting to some of the Wapatki people that they might want to revisit how they analyze and date some of their sites. But then you can then map it into phases, if you like. And I say this has all been automated. One test that we did of this is a large site, one of the sites that Joe pointed me at, and this got at something that Dave has been after me to do. He says, can you find multi-component behavior in a site? Meaning you can find this pit house was built and occupied in this period, and maybe this Pueblo, it's 100 meters away, was built and occupied in a different period. And so we took a large site, which is 34,000 square meters, so that's an 8-acre plus site. And Christine and I, when we were looking at this, we thought it looks different in the north end of the site versus the south end of the site. Although when you define a site, if you're looking for a shared distribution, you try to find an empty space between, there's a uniform shared distribution across the 2 areas. And so we actually broke it up into a north or an east and a west end. And sure enough, we found out that the east end had a different date range significantly than the west end. And we also found out that the planeware distributions were very different. That the predominant planewares in both ends of it were Tusayan graywares, but it had a heavy Coanina planeware distribution in the earlier times, and then a more heavy Alameda brownware or Sonagua distribution in a later time. So it turns out these techniques can actually differentiate cultures and times within large sites, which we were kind of found quite interesting. These are a lot of the references, but I'll finish this up now just to kind of show you. We have 4 or 5 of these really interesting sites, which I think remind me a bit of what we were seeing down in the Verde Valley, where they take a very tall basalt knob, sometimes 30 to 40 meters high, very inaccessible to get to the top, and you'll find a big pueblo on the top of that. We have a half a dozen of those out there. We have at least 5 great kivas that we have found out there. And Dave has gone out, and Jeremy has gone out, and some other people says, yeah, we think those are great kivas. And that's a very unexpected result, because supposedly there weren't any great kivas up in that area. Here's a Joe Vogel photograph. This is what Joe does to me. He comes in and he takes a photograph of a site which is up on top of this guy right here. First time I went up, I couldn't figure out a way to get to the top of it. It was so steep. I finally found an access route that kind of wound its way up here. There's a wall across here, a little pueblo up on top of there. But this is what Joe will give me. He'll give me an aerial photograph and some UTMs, and then it's up to me to walk out there and climb to the top, and like the guys down in the Verde have done. And I told Joe, that's the fun part of it. Yeah. There are some nice sandstone pueblos. No, we don't have the spectacular sandstone pueblos that you see in Wapatki, but there are some. There are some. This is actually, I think, a 30-room pueblo. Walls are still about 12 to 15 feet high. Very, very dense sherd scatters in all of these. Beautiful tools. And I have a list now of about 20 to 25 rock art sites that have never been recorded out there. So, cool stuff.